Here we are back on the Connecting the Dots YouTube channel, and here I'm with you, Dr. Claude Anderson, your forensic historian. Today I want to talk about something that's very important also, because it brought to my mind some comments made about people about the United States Constitution, where they were saying that they got constitutional rights and blacks had constitutional rights. Let's get very specific for a second and cut the BS. That based on the basic Constitution of the United States, black people have never really had any substantive rights that they could pick up and acquire and use. Let's go back in history, because see, the Constitution was written specifically based on what white folk wanted to do with black folk in the country, and that was to use them as a labor class under a doctrine called the doctrine of unequal exchange. And when they first started bringing blacks into the country, they said straight up that black people should never be permitted to enjoy the fruits of white society. That was a cardinal rule. And to make sure that stayed in effect, they put in effect they call a doctrine of unequal exchange. And so the Constitution was being considered. They met in Philadelphia, and they said, now we're going to put into place, start a whole new democracy in the world. Make the United States the cradle of democracy, where anybody around the world can come here and get all these freedoms and rights. And they said, and let's write that up. And Madison had suggested, and then they said, well, Benjamin Franklin had to say, I support that. And Thomas Jefferson said, I will write it. And George Washington, okay, fine, you write it up. And so they started writing the United States Constitution. And after the Declaration of Independence in 1776. So in 1779, they came and met in Philadelphia to put this thing together. They said, okay, here's what we're going to do. We're going to write a United States Constitution. And but say we got one problem though. The problem is that we're going to write this Constitution to be an inspiration for all the people in the world that can come here and get what we call the American dream, which means free labor and free land. And but to do that, we got a problem. We're going to take the land from the Indians. We're going to offer them free labor. But how do we do that? How do we write a constitution that's going to steal the Indian land and shut black folk down and make them 3/5 of a human being equal to a field animal and use them to enrich everybody but themselves? They said, so they met in Philadelphia, and for the first week of the meeting, with all these about 56 so-called people leaders in the country are going to come together and write a constitution. They said, we got to resolve how we're going to do that, because we look like hypocrites if we're going to enslave all these black folk at the same time invite everybody else to come to the country to get everything and give these black folk nothing. How do we put that into a constitution? And so they met in that first week discussing this. How do we do it? And they said, well, first of all, let's close the doors and close the shutters on the windows so nobody can hear us. And they finally discussed it and argued about it. Yeah, we need to have this. We need to be open. We need to be the cradle of democracy. We need to be offering freedom to everybody. We need to saying that every human being got a guaranteed right for life and liberty and pursuit of property. And they said, well, we can't, but black folk can be the property. How do we do that? And so finally they came up with a good suggestion. It says, here's what let's do. Let's start in the Constitution. Let's use very broad and ambiguous language. And we talk about whites, people coming who can classify as whites are being viewed as whites versus those who come in here classified as slaves and be viewed as property. And so what they did, the Constitution, they wrote up two things. They used language in the Constitution that spoke to black folk and language in the Constitution that spoke to whites. So if you read the United States Constitution, and it says very specific that all human beings have a right for life, liberty, and pursuit of property or happiness. They weren't talking about black folk. When they said that all human beings have a right to vote, all citizens this, all citizens that, they were only talking about black folk, meaning white folk. When they want to talk about black folk, they use different language. In the code, in the Constitution, they talked about black people. They use coded words like those who indebted, those who in bondage, that unhappy lot, those who are who have no rights, those who are without privilege. They use very broad terms that you never know who they were talking about. And there are those who are 3/5 of a human being, those who are equal to a field animal, and those who are in bondage. That was all those broad terms were used for black folk. They put this piece of document together called the Constitution. So that's what everybody listened to and read. But black folk are never told that you're not in the Constitution, except underneath those very broad terms they were using to identify you. And this went into effect in 1789. And then as soon as they ratified it in 1789, the very next year in 1790, they came up with a thing called the First Nationalization and Immigration Law. And what they said in that is that now we're going to invite all these people from around the world to come to America. Give us your humble, your free, your hungry, your poor, seeking freedom, and all this kind of BS. And but you might see now on the statue, bottom of the Statue of Liberty, they weren't talking about black folk at that point in time, even though ironically a black woman had modeled for that statue, but at the bottom of it, the inscription was only for whites coming from around the world, because what they want to do is to populate this country with whites and to dominate and own and control, and black folk to be impoverished and poor and to be equal to a field animal. And so that came up in 1789. It was called the First Nationalization and Immigration Law, which says that black folk would never be able to enjoy the fruits of white society. That stayed into effect in the Constitution all the way up until, let's go up ahead now and see how they maintain that. Let's jump up to, let's say, 1803. In 1803 now, they had a case called the Marlboro and Madison case that was talking about some major issues in the country about who can do what. And at that time, they said, let's let the Supreme Court make a decision. So they established the United States Supreme Court, and they stacked that Supreme Court with all white slave owners. The first 57 people appointed to the United States Supreme Court were white slave owners. Naturally, they were racist, but they put them into the Supreme Court. And but one thing they did not give them, which the white Supreme Court had been abusing, they gave them authority to do three things on the Supreme Court. One, to inject themselves into their lower case rulings in the court system. Two, to be involved, they can be involved in ambassadorial appointments. Or three, they can get involved in anything where a federal official has failed to carry out his duties. Those are the only three roles and goals and authorities that the United States Supreme Court held. And that came in through what they call it the Marlboro and Madison decision. And that went along like that up until about 1857, when all of a sudden a black man says, I want some rights. I should be free. I was living in Missouri, now I'm in Illinois. I should be free. I want to have a right to be excluded from bondage. He went to the Supreme Court, and then we went to Supreme Court Justice Haney, and his court ruled against him, saying a black man has no rights that a white person is bound to respect. Period. Because you're black, you have no rights. And so, but Dred Scott says, but I should have some rights based on the Constitution. All these things, but I should have a right to vote and be a citizen and get land and resources. And they said, no, it's not, because you're not a citizen. You are property. You have no rights. And therefore you have no rights that white folk are bound to respect. That's the United States Constitution. The Constitution is made up of 12 amendments, 1 through 12. And those 1 through 12 amendments were strictly for anybody coming to America who can be classified as whites. They got everything they wanted until the present time. They had no need for anything else. They had no need for anything but beyond those 12 amendments. But after the Civil War, and Civil War was over, you had a few radical Republicans said we have to make some changes in the Constitution, because the Dred Scott decision told Dred Scott in 1857 that he had no rights that a white man was bound to respect. You guys can't turn 5 million black folks, ex-slaves, are loose and say they have no rights. We have to come up with a constitution for them. So what they did then, the radical Republicans got together and they enacted 3 laws. The 13th Amendment made 3 laws injected into the Constitution. The 13th Amendment, the 14th Amendment, the 15th Amendment. Those 3 laws are put into the Constitution as a second Constitution to be an add-on to the 1 through 12 Constitution. Nobody tells you this, but let's connect those dots. Whites in America, for all those 360 years, they had all their rights embedded in the 1 through 12 amendments in the Constitution. That was it. They didn't have any issues abiding by that. Everybody understood what it was for. Whites got all the rights to vote, doing what they wanted to do. White women got everything they wanted to get. But after the Civil War, when the radical Republicans made an addition to the Constitution by making it a second Constitution, the 13th and 14th and 15th Amendment, they put in those clauses which were specifically designed to give rights and resources to black people in America, native blacks, nobody else. The 13th Amendment says right across the board that blacks in America must be treated in all respects equal to how a white person is treated in America. And so if you're not enslaving whites, you have no justification ground for mistreating and enslaving blacks. And that if you're going to give white folks rights and privileges and resources, you must also give them to blacks. That's the 13th Amendment, that blacks should be treated in all manners equal to how whites are being treated. That was the 13th Amendment. The 14th Amendment went a little further and said that it's obliging or mandated upon every level of government to exercise all necessary means and measures to lift the incidence of slavery off the backs of black people. It didn't say anything about gays, women, midgets, humpbacks, people with hemorrhoids, ingrown toenails. It says of black people to contract the Dred Scott decision. That's why you had Republicans, radical Republicans, stand up in the House of Representatives and say that in this country, only two things that a black person will ever be. They're either going to be free or they're going to be slaves. But to be free, they must minimally have 40 acres, a mule, and $100. And that's what the 13th and 14th Amendment is going to be about. And the 15th Amendment. In addition to that, to make sure that this Dred Scott decision, which says a black man has no rights, get eradicated, we're going to also enact civil rights laws. They tried to write the 1865 Civil Rights Law and again in 1867, strictly and solely for black people. The civil rights laws in this country were put in a place only for black people, nobody else. Whites had all their civil rights in the 1st through the 12th. And all the immigrants coming to this country that are viewed and classified as whites got it in the 1 through 12. All Asians coming to this country, Hispanics and Arabs coming to this country who are classified as whites, they got their rights in the 1 through 12. Women got all their rights through the 1 through 12. Gays and homosexuals got their rights in the 1 through 12. But the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment was written strictly and solely for black people, period. Nobody else. And so, and that's what it was for. And what they said is that black folk must minimally have some access to some resources to be a competitive people. Now, that was in 1866, 1865. Now, by 1868, 69, some whites down in New Orleans from the meatpacking industry says, well, let's go out of the 1 through 12 amendment. Let's go over into the 13th and 14th amendment and use all those amendments that's set aside for black folk. Why can't we use them? And so they filed a lawsuit in 1869 saying we want to be able to use all those amendments for black folk. And that was they went to the Supreme Court. They got into the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court made a major ruling in 1872 called the Slaughterhouse case, which says that no white person or anybody else is entitled to use the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment, and those civil rights laws was written strictly and exclusively for black people. That's called the Slaughterhouse case of 1872. And then later on in 1879, the Saunders case said the same thing, that the 13th and 14th and 15th Amendment civil rights laws were put in place to protect the ex-slaves in America, the black population. They should not be entered by anyone else and be misused, because if you let other people use it, that's how whites come up with this thing about, if you're going to try to take back what we took from you, that's reverse discrimination. So that's why it's a joke to have all these other groups coming here being classified as immigrants and white immigrants, and again, being able to use the 13th and 14th and 15th Amendment. That was strictly for black folk and ex-slaves. If they're not ex-slaves, Native Americans, ex-slaves, black Americans, ex-slaves, they have no entitlements of the 13th, the 14th, the 15th Amendment of the civil rights laws. Neither were women entitled to be under there. Women got all their rights. Women all the way through slavery. White women had all their rights. The only thing they didn't have in 1850 when they started the civil rights movement, and when they started rather the women's movement, they were looking for the right to vote. Why? Because they said we want to have a right to vote even if we don't own property. Because up until the end of the Civil War, or really up until the 1919, white women had to own property to vote. But white women who did own property have always had the right to vote. Even during slavery, white women had the right to vote if they were property owners. And so what I'm saying to you is that the immigration policies, the civil rights laws in this country have been misused and abused, and the primary perpetrator of that has been the United States Supreme Court. And here's why I'm saying about the United States Supreme Court. United States Supreme Court is a guardian of racism in this country. Their primary responsibility, all the way back since they were appointed in 1803, was to be able to misuse and guard and maintain slavery and the subordination of black folk in the country. And that is in violation of the 13th and 14th Amendment. The United States Supreme Court has no right to overrule anything pertaining to black folk in terms of rights, obligations, privileges, and reparations. They have no rights. Their rights are restricted to being in ambassadorial appointments and relieving people who have violated their oath of office in the federal government, in a federal job, or in a lowercase ruling. That's it. And so black folk need to understand and sort of reverting back and saying we're reclaiming our rights and privileges and recognition in the 13th and 14th Amendment and the civil rights laws. That's our laws, nobody else's. And cease and desist allowing anybody to come in this country saying that they have a right to the 13th and 14th and 15th Amendment and the civil rights laws. Those civil rights laws have been corrupted. They were corrupted all through history. They were corrupted in the 1960s when black folk again let everybody come in and proclaim them to be, say we're entitled to, we got 14th Amendment rights. We got rights to this and that. You don't. If you're not black, you had no rights. Anyway, that's connecting the dots for you. This is Dr. Claude Anderson signing off again this day for Tuesday on Connecting the Dots.